Once, America's richest families built mansions so vast they defied imagination, but most of them are gone, blown up, burned, buried beneath silence. What happened to these palaces of power? Was it greed, war, or something far more unexpected? Tonight, we uncover the hidden truth behind America's lost mansions, and the shocking reason their glory was never meant to last. Stay with us, because what happened next changed everything. The Gilded Age rose like a sunrise over the American horizon, a time when the nation's ambition burned hotter than the steel in its foundries. Railroads cut through untouched wilderness, fortunes appeared overnight, and cities climbed skyward in defiance of gravity and reason. The air itself seemed electric, charged with invention, industry, and the promise of boundless wealth. Yet beneath the glittering surface of progress, there was another truth, one less visible but far more human. A truth of fragile credit, swelling debt, and dreams that glowed too brightly to last. The grandeur that dazzled the world was built not upon gold, but upon paper, risk, and a collective illusion that prosperity could stretch forever without consequence. In the mansions of Fifth Avenue and the sprawling estates of Newport, every arch and chandelier reflected this contradiction. The walls were lined with imported silk, the floors with marble quarried from Italy, and the gardens sculpted by hands that would never dine in the halls they adorned. The men who built these palaces, the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Carnegies, saw themselves as architects of a new empire, heirs to Europe's old nobility, yet they lived in a world of constant financial tension. Behind every gilded doorway, accountants worked in candlelight, balancing ledgers that trembled under the weight of loans. The Gilded Age was not a golden age. It was an age plated in gold, its brilliance concealing the corrosion underneath. Speculation became a religion. Banks loaned vast sums against uncertain futures. Industrialists borrowed from foreign financiers, betting on markets that could turn overnight. Wealth ballooned, but it was wealth without roots, a fragile lattice of credit and confidence. Fortunes rose like glass towers, beautiful and brittle, shattering at the slightest tremor of panic. Behind the facade of elegance lay the same fear that haunted every empire built too fast, the fear that it could all vanish with a single downturn. For many, it did. The Panic of 1873 was a warning shot, but few listened. Mansions continued to rise, each grander than the last, as if marble could outshout mathematics. The rich competed not in business alone, but in spectacle. A ballroom larger than a cathedral, a dinner service made of solid gold, a garden that required an army of gardeners. These were not expressions of joy, but of insecurity, attempts to prove stability through extravagance. It was a race no one could win. The more they built, the more they borrowed. The more they borrowed, the more fragile their world became. Beneath this pyramid of privilege were millions of Americans who carried its weight without share or glory. Steelworkers, miners, factory girls, the human foundation on which these fortunes stood, lived in conditions so harsh they bordered on invisible servitude. The Gilded Age's brilliance depended on their silence. Their labor fueled the opulence of a few while their wages barely sustained their lives. They built the mansions they would never enter, the railroads they could not afford to ride. To them, the golden skyline was not a symbol of hope, but a reminder of distance, the unreachable summit of someone else's success. Yet even among the wealthy, security was an illusion. The economy itself was a high-stakes gamble. The rise of industrial monopolies, the corruption of politics, and the speculative frenzy of Wall Street all intertwined in a delicate balance that could, and did, collapse. When markets faltered, the damage reached everywhere. Servants were dismissed, estates left unfinished, debts quietly forgiven or forever unpaid. In letters and diaries, the wives of tycoons wrote of sleepless nights, of husbands pacing through candlelit studies, of a creeping anxiety they could never name aloud. To the world, they were untouchable. In truth, they were prisoners of appearances. For every mansion that gleamed, there was another that fell into ruin before its time. Construction halted mid-wall. Marble fountains never filled. Silk drapes gathered dust in rooms that no one could afford to heat. Wealth became its own burden, an endless obligation to maintain the illusion of prosperity. And when the illusion cracked, it often did so quietly, behind closed doors. Assets were sold discreetly. Servants were let go in silence. The newspapers rarely told of these small deaths of grandeur, but they were everywhere. Private implosions of pride, the slow unraveling of families who had mistaken opulence for permanence. Foreign loans played their own part in the Gilded tragedy. European bankers, eager to profit from America's growth, poured money into its industries, expecting endless returns. But when the market soured, the creditors came calling. What had seemed like wealth revealed itself as dependency. The grand homes built with borrowed capital became symbols of overreach. Some owners fled to Europe to escape their debts. Others turned their estates into hotels or schools just to survive. The marble and gold that once symbolized dominance now stood as silent witnesses to decline. Inflation gnawed at fortunes from within. The more the currency swelled, the less the grandeur meant. $1 million could no longer buy what it once did, and the very cost of maintaining luxury became unsustainable. Taxes increased, servants demanded wages that reflected their impossible labor, and the world beyond the gates began to change. The age of industry was giving way to an age of accountability, and the palaces of pride were ill-prepared for that reckoning. What the photographs of the Gilded Age never showed were the unpaid bills folded into drawers, the urgent letters from creditors, the auctions held in secret to cover losses. Behind the elegance was exhaustion. Behind the music and light was the knowledge that nothing so extravagant could endure. The era's richest men were not content. They were cornered by their own excess. The public saw confidence, but history reveals the truth. It was fear of losing status, of slipping back into the anonymity from which they had risen. Their palaces were fortresses against that fear, yet each one was built on ground too soft to hold. Even as America's economy grew, its foundation was uneven. Industrial monopolies consumed smaller businesses, leaving instability masked by progress. The rich grew richer, but their wealth depended on an increasingly fragile system of speculation, underpaid labor, and foreign dependence. The working class bore the strain, the middle class shrank, and the entire nation teetered between triumph and collapse. It was a paradox, a century of innovation shadowed by inequality, a season of grandeur haunted by fragility. And still, they built. Perhaps that was the truest mark of the Gilded Age, the refusal to stop building. Even as the ground trembled beneath them, they built to forget the fear. They built to prove they had conquered it. Yet every brick, every chandelier, every gala was a reminder of the price that ambition demands when it outruns wisdom. Gilded grandeur was not the product of endless wealth. It was the last performance of borrowed glory, staged before an audience too dazzled to see the cracks forming in the stage beneath their feet. They rose like myths against the horizon. Mansions that seemed to breathe power, ambition, and the illusion of eternity. From the coasts of Long Island to the sweeping hills of the Hudson Valley, these colossal homes stood as America's declaration that it had arrived among the great nations of the world. Every column, every vaulted ceiling, every gilded staircase whispered the same story. Here was success carved into stone. Yet behind the opulence lay fragility. These were monuments not of permanence, but of impermanence disguised. Mansions built on fragile foundations, both literal and financial, stood as testaments to a nation intoxicated by progress and blinded by the shimmer of its own reflection. They were built in an era when ambition outpaced stability. Industry had made kings of men who, only a generation before, might have lived in modest houses of brick and timber. Now they commissioned architects from Europe, imported marble from Greece, and shipped chandeliers across oceans. The estates stretched across hundreds of acres, demanding armies of gardeners, maids, cooks, and craftsmen to maintain their perfection. But beneath that polish, the soil itself trembled with debt, speculation, and a quiet sense that the wealth fueling it all was not as solid as the marble suggested. The foundations of these mansions, for all their grandeur, were laid atop uncertainty, fragile as glass, beautiful as a mirage. Each mansion was more than a home. It was an act of defiance. In their creation, America's newly rich sought to rewrite social order, to prove that birthright was no longer the only path to greatness. They borrowed from the architecture of Europe, Versailles, the English country house, the Italian villa, but what they created was uniquely American, grand, confident, excessive, and restless. These were structures that didn't merely exist, they announced themselves. Their facades gleamed with imported limestone and gold leaf, their interiors flooded with paintings, tapestries, and furniture bought at the price of small fortunes. They were built to outshine, to outlast, to dominate memory itself. But even as the plaster dried, the seeds of collapse were already there. In the loans taken, the market stretched, the endless cost of maintaining illusion. For all their visual might, these mansions were delicate ecosystems. The cost of heating a ballroom in winter could rival a worker's yearly wage. The gardens consumed the labor of dozens. The upkeep devoured wealth faster than it could be made. Many owners knew this but pressed on anyway, trapped by pride and expectation. To scale back was to signal weakness. To admit strain was to lose face in a world where reputation was as fragile as glass. The walls that gleamed so brightly during grand receptions often echoed later with silence. Servants dismissed, rooms shuttered, hallways dark. The same stone that once proclaimed strength came to symbolize strain, a weight too heavy to sustain. It was not only the structures that stood on fragile ground, but the very idea behind them. These palaces were built on a philosophy that equated visibility with worth. Success had to be seen to be believed, and in being seen, it demanded ever greater spectacle. Yet the more magnificent the display, the more invisible the instability became. The facade of luxury depended on a continuous flow of credit, on industries that might falter, on markets that could collapse without warning. When the financial panics came, and they always did, those marble staircases led nowhere. The families who had built their empires on steel and oil and speculation found themselves selling paintings, dismissing staff, or quietly closing off wings of their homes they could no longer afford to heat. To the visitors who glimpsed them from afar, these mansions appeared indestructible, the very embodiment of American permanence. But inside, cracks formed, literal and metaphorical. Roofs leaked when maintenance funds ran dry. Lavish parties turned to quiet dinners. The servants' quarters, once overflowing with life, emptied as wages went unpaid. The illusion of control gave way to the reality of fragility. A single shift in the market, a downturn in trade, a war overseas, any could send the balance crumbling. And because the homes were built not only of stone but of ego, their collapse was not just economic but personal. There was a strange loneliness to that splendor. The architects who designed these estates poured their genius into them, yet often they knew their creations would not last. Fashion would change, fortunes would fade. Even as they drew the blueprints, they were sketching ephemera, structures meant to astonish in their moment, but never built to survive the future. They were theater, spectacle, performance. Every ball and banquet was another act in a play of power, and like all performances, it would end when the curtain fell. The tragedy was that those inside the story did not see it coming. The paradox of these mansions was that they stood as symbols of strength, but their very existence depended on the fragility of wealth in a volatile age. The railroads that brought riches could just as easily bring ruin. The industries that birthed millionaires were as unstable as the markets that fed them. Even the materials themselves, for all their grandeur, were subject to decay. Wood that warped, plaster that cracked, foundations that shifted on unsteady soil. Nature, indifferent to wealth, reclaimed what was built too quickly. Winds battered rooftops, rain seeped through walls, vines crept over the facades until the once perfect geometry of man's ambition dissolved into the wild symmetry of time. In these homes, luxury was both armor and curse. It protected their owners from the harsh realities outside the gates, but it also imprisoned them. Every tapestry, every chandelier, every imported artifact became a reminder of the expectations they had to maintain. Many of those who lived in such splendor were not free. They were captives of their own magnificence. They could not leave the stage they had built. They could not downsize, could not simplify, could not admit that the dream had grown heavier than they could bear. Behind the portraits of elegance were faces lined with exhaustion, with the quiet terror of those who sensed that the world was changing faster than their fortunes could adapt. When the tides of economy shifted, as they inevitably did, these homes became burdens rather than triumphs. Taxes rose, the cost of labor increased, and the social tide began to turn against opulence. What was once admired as achievement came to be seen as excess. Newspapers began to whisper of waste, of arrogance, of the distance between those who lived in palaces and those who toiled in factories. The very symbols of power became symbols of decay. And so, one by one, the great mansions emptied. Some were sold off, others left to rot. A few met fire or demolition, their marble shattered, their gardens overtaken by weeds. In the end, these houses were metaphors for the age itself, magnificent but unstable, visionary but unsustainable. They embodied the nation's hunger to rise, its faith in progress, its belief that beauty and ambition could outpace consequence. But like all dreams built too quickly, their foundations could not support their own weight. They stood as monuments to a generation that believed it could master destiny with wealth and stone, never realizing that the true foundation of a house or an era is not opulence but endurance. Beneath the soaring ceilings of America's Gilded Age mansions, where orchestras played under crystal chandeliers and laughter echoed against gilded walls, there existed another world entirely, one made of sweat, soot, and silence. The true foundation of those towering estates was not marble or iron, but people. Ordinary men, women, and children whose lives were spent fueling the machinery of luxury they would never touch. Their names rarely appeared in the newspapers that celebrated the era's great fortunes, yet their hands built the railroads, cleaned the halls, and stoked the fires that kept the palaces glowing. Every brick of grandeur was balanced upon invisible shoulders. In the factories that lined the smoky edges of American cities, the work never stopped. Steam hissed, gears turned, and the air thickened with ash and iron dust. Children as young as 10 stood beside machines taller than themselves, feeding them fabric, wood, and steel. The wealthy commissioned their mansions with money made from these very mills and foundries, but they rarely saw the faces of those who paid the true price. In the textile mills, fingers bled from thread and dust choked the lungs of workers who earned barely enough to eat. They toiled 16 hours a day so that the fabrics of Europe could drape the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. In coal towns scattered across Pennsylvania, miners descended into the dark before sunrise, their lamps flickering like stars swallowed by the earth. Their labor powered the trains that carried steel to the cities, and the electricity that illuminated the mansions of the rich. But above ground, their families lived in one-room houses built by the very companies that paid them. Wages were docked for food, rent, tools, until debt became a permanent state of life. The gilded ceilings of the elite shimmered because the miners below the soil had no ceiling at all, only rock pressing down upon them and the constant threat of collapse. On the estates themselves, armies of servants moved like ghosts through the corridors. Butlers polished silver until it reflected the light of chandeliers that cost more than their lifetime wages. Maids rose before dawn to scrub marble floors until their hands cracked and bled. Cooks worked in the inferno of basement kitchens, turning out feasts for guests who would never know their names. They lived in narrow rooms under the eaves or deep below ground, sleeping in uniforms, always ready to serve at the ring of a bell. Some had fled poverty in Ireland, Italy, or Poland, crossing oceans for the promise of opportunity, only to find themselves bound again, this time by invisible chains of service and dependence. In the cities, laborers hauled stone, drove carriages, and laid bricks in the winter cold. The wealth of the few depended on the endless exhaustion of the many. For every grand ballroom, 100 backs had bent to raise it. For every chandelier, there was a worker who had risked his life in a mine to extract the ore that made it shine. The Gilded Age was a machine of splendor powered by human endurance, and like all machines, it consumed what fueled it. The newspapers called the era one of progress, but progress came at a human cost measured in blisters, broken bones, and unmarked graves. As the rich hosted galas that lasted until dawn, the poor crowded into tenements where entire families shared a single room. Windows were scarce, heat was rare, and disease was common. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and influenza spread through the narrow hallways of immigrant neighborhoods while only a few miles away. Fountains sparkled and champagne flowed, yet even in the slums, people dreamed. They looked up at the glowing windows of the mansions on the hill and wondered what it would be like to live without hunger or fear. They did not resent beauty. They resented the distance between those who built it and those who enjoyed it. Wars, too, demanded their share. When the nation called for sacrifice, it was not the heirs of fortunes who filled the ranks, but the laborers, the factorymen, the farmers, and the newly arrived immigrants. They left behind wives and children who would struggle alone, while the wealthy lent money to the government at interest. The burden of defense and debt fell hardest on those least able to bear it. After the guns fell silent, the same men who had fought returned to the same factories, the same mines, the same endless grind that kept the engines of industry turning. Inflation, born of conflict and greed, eroded what little the working class possessed. Prices rose faster than wages. Families pawned their few possessions to buy bread while the magnates of finance speculated in comfort. The contrast between opulence and hardship grew so stark it became almost unbearable. Yet the system persisted because hope persisted. Each generation believed that hard work might one day open the gates of those grand estates, not realizing that the gates were never meant to open, they were meant to divide. Even those who served within the mansions could not escape the burden of hierarchy. Servants were trained to move soundlessly, to avert their eyes, to make themselves invisible. In the presence of wealth, their humanity was often disregarded, their exhaustion dismissed. They watched the decline of their employers with quiet understanding, for they knew better than anyone how fragile the facade truly was. When fortunes crumbled and mansions emptied, it was the servants who saw it first. The canceled orders, the unpaid wages, the silence where music once filled the halls. They bore witness to both the rise and fall of opulence, yet their own stories were rarely told. In the countryside, farmers felt the same weight in a different form. The markets that enriched industrialists often impoverished those who worked the land. As railroads expanded and prices fell, debt consumed entire generations of farmers. Many mortgaged their fields to banks owned by the same men who built the great estates. When crops failed or prices dropped, foreclosure came swiftly, and families who had worked their soil for decades watched it sold at auction. Their loss became another man's estate, their endurance another man's profit. Through it all, the myth of the self-made man persisted. The public was told that any citizen could rise from nothing to everything, that the Gilded Age was proof of opportunity, not inequality. But for everyone who rose, thousands remained unseen, their labor forming the invisible backbone of progress. They were the ones who laid the bricks of empire and received dust in return. They believed in the promise of America because they had to. Belief was the only luxury they could afford. The newspapers celebrated the lavish balls, the diamond-studded gowns, the banquets that lasted until morning. They rarely printed the stories of those who washed the linens afterward, or swept the marble floors of spilled wine. Yet the story of the Gilded Age is incomplete without them, for they were the true measure of its cost. It was not only the rich who lived through that age, it was also the countless ordinary people who carried its weight, who kept the fires burning, who built and maintained a world they were never allowed to share. Their hands shaped the age as much as any tycoon's vision, though history would long forget their names. They bore the burden of ambition not their own, sacrificing time, health, and hope to sustain a dream that belonged to others. Theirs was a quiet endurance, a steady strength that kept the nation standing while the palaces gleamed above. Without them, there would have been no Gilded Age at all, only an age of shadows and unfulfilled desire. They were the foundation beneath the marble, the pulse beneath the music, the unseen rhythm of a country chasing eternity through the fragile beauty of wealth. The collapse came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow unraveling, a tightening of the air that those who lived through it could feel long before they could name it. What had once seemed like an unending ascent, an age of progress, invention, and opulence, began to tremble under its own weight. The signs were everywhere, if anyone cared to look. Factories that had hummed with ceaseless energy began to quiet. Trains ran with fewer cars. Banks, once overflowing with the profits of speculation, whispered of insolvency in the corridors behind locked doors. The Gilded Age, that dazzling display of ambition and excess, was beginning to show its cracks. The same forces that had built its marble palaces and filled its glittering ballrooms now turned against them. War, inflation, overreach, and the impossible pressure of keeping illusions alive in a world that was running out of patience. When the great wars came, they arrived like storms sweeping across the fragile architecture of prosperity. The demand for steel, coal, and arms brought brief booms, but they also drained the nation's reserves, both in treasure and in spirit. Wealth was no longer simply a matter of enterprise. It became a matter of survival. Governments borrowed heavily from abroad, issuing bonds and promises that mortgaged the future for the sake of the present. The same families who once lent money to the state in confidence soon found themselves entangled in debts of their own making. The golden thread of fortune twisted into a noose of obligation. The cost of victory was measured not only in lives but in the silent erosion of wealth. Inflation seeped through every layer of society like a slow poison. The value of the dollar shrank, and what once purchased extravagance now barely sustained necessity. Estates that had been symbols of stability began to bleed money. Wages rose for the first time in decades, but so did the price of everything else. Coal, servants, imported goods, the endless maintenance of grandeur. The lavish mansions of the elite were no longer just homes. They were economic traps, consuming more resources each year than their owners could justify. Many tried to sell, but who would buy such monuments in a time of uncertainty? Those who could not sell pretended not to care, hosting smaller gatherings, closing off wings of their houses, telling guests that modesty was the new fashion while quietly dismissing half their staff. The illusion of control began to crumble in the boardrooms where fortunes had been made. Markets that had once responded predictably now lurched like wounded beasts. Investments that promised steady growth collapsed without warning. The stock market, once the heart of America's optimism, became a stage for panic. Men who had been kings of industry watched their empires evaporate in a matter of days. The same newspapers that had once celebrated them now printed their ruin in headlines for all to see. Pride turned to silence. Silence turned to shame. Families that had once defined the word dynasty now faced bankruptcy, forced to sell jewels, artwork, and heirlooms just to survive. Even the houses themselves seemed to sense the change. Marble cracked in winter's frost. Roofs leaked where there was no money to repair them. The grand gardens, once symbols of eternal beauty, grew wild as the gardeners vanished. Dust settled on gilded mirrors, and the halls that had once echoed with music filled instead with a stillness that felt like grief. Fireplaces went cold because coal was too expensive, and chandeliers hung unlit in rooms that had once shone brighter than day. Servants who had lived their lives in service left in search of work elsewhere. The mansions, once alive with the rhythm of endless activity, fell quiet, vast shells of memory and echo. War had not only drained fortunes, it had changed the soul of the nation. The people who returned from the front were different, hardened, disillusioned, unwilling to bow before inherited wealth. The world had shifted, and the old hierarchies no longer carried the same reverence. Luxury, once admired, began to look like arrogance. The public mood turned inward, practical, weary. The extravagant excesses of the Gilded Age felt grotesque in the shadow of loss. Even those who still had money began to hide it. Philanthropy replaced display. Charity became the language of survival, a way to justify what had once been celebrated as conquest. The weight of taxes and regulation grew heavier as governments sought to rebuild from war's destruction. Landowners who had once paid little found themselves owing sums they could not meet. Income taxes, once temporary, became permanent fixtures of the economy. Property taxes rose relentlessly, and with them came the slow death of old estates. Maintaining hundreds of acres of land, dozens of rooms, and endless ornamentation became unsustainable. Many families tore down their own homes to avoid the burden, selling the materials for scrap or demolishing the mansions altogether to escape their ghosts. What had taken years and fortunes to build could vanish in a week under the strike of a wrecking crew. Foreign loans, once seen as a mark of global confidence, now revealed the true dependency of American wealth. The interest payments alone consumed the profits of entire industries. The banks in London, Paris, and Berlin that had once financed American ambition now demanded repayment in gold. The illusion of independence shattered as the flow of capital reversed. Even the richest families were forced to reckon with a simple truth: much of their wealth had never truly been theirs. It was borrowed, leveraged, and bound to the shifting tides of international finance. When those tides receded, the sand beneath the palaces was left bare. The workers who had once served quietly began to rise, demanding fair pay and humane conditions. Strikes broke out in factories and mines, sometimes violently, always desperately. The labor movement was no longer a whisper but a roar, and the age of unquestioned privilege trembled under its sound. The nation that had once celebrated the triumph of its industrialists now began to question the moral cost of their empires. The divide between rich and poor, once politely ignored, became impossible to hide. The old world was ending, not with a single event, but with a series of slow collapses, economic, social, and emotional. Through it all, the architecture of the Gilded Age stood as a kind of theater, where the ruins of ambition played out in silence. Fires consumed some estates, accidents others. A few were abandoned altogether, left to the mercy of vandals and time. Children played in what had once been drawing rooms. Rain fell through broken ceilings onto the faded remains of luxury. In the span of a generation, the symbols of power became relics of arrogance. The marble cracked, the iron rusted, and the portraits of ancestors watched from the walls as the very idea of their world disintegrated. The collapse through war, inflation, and economic reckoning did not merely erase fortunes, it rewrote the identity of a nation. The Gilded Age had promised eternal ascent, but history reminded its heirs that every empire, however brilliant, is bound by the limits of reality. The palaces that once declared victory over time now stood in quiet surrender, reminders that no wealth can outlast the forces that created it, and no age can hold forever against the slow, patient collapse of its own illusions. When the lights dimmed in the great houses and the music stopped echoing through their halls, what remained was not silence, but reflection. The marble had cracked, the gardens had overgrown, and the grand carriages had been sold or forgotten, yet something deeper endured beyond the ruins. In the ashes of extravagance, a quieter strength took root, one not born of wealth, but of endurance. The collapse of the Gilded Age, for all its tragedy, revealed something essential about the human spirit, that when the gilding fades, resilience remains. The people who survived the unraveling of that world did so not through fortune, but through adaptation, through the stubborn insistence that life must continue even when grandeur cannot. The fall of the great mansions left a void in the American imagination. The newspapers that once chronicled every gala and ball now printed stories of survival and rebuilding. The nation had shifted from the language of luxury to the vocabulary of labor. It was in the small towns, the farms, and the crowded city streets that America rediscovered itself. Those who had once built for others now began slowly to build for themselves. The children of servants, miners, and factory workers carried forward lessons that no school could teach: the value of persistence, the dignity of effort, and the quiet heroism of those who endure without applause. The old families who lost their fortunes were forced to confront a truth they had long ignored, that worth cannot be measured in gold. Some sold their estates and moved into modest homes, finding in simplicity a kind of peace they had never known amid the excess. Others reinvented themselves, turning from opulence to service, philanthropy, or public life. The shock of loss stripped away pretense and exposed humanity in its rawest form. It was no longer the architecture of marble that defined greatness, but the architecture of character. The Gilded Age had taught America how to rise. Its collapse taught it how to stand when rising was no longer possible. In the small towns that stretched between the ruins of grandeur, communities began to rebuild from the ground up. They built schools where there had been factories, libraries where there had been warehouses, parks where there had been private estates. The wealth that once belonged to the few slowly found its way, in fragments, to the many. Foundations were established, universities endowed, museums opened to the public. The art, books, and music that had once been locked behind gilded doors were shared with those who had never been invited inside. Out of the decay of privilege came the seed of access, and with it, the first quiet steps toward a more inclusive dream. For the working class, whose sweat had built the fortunes of the elite, the age's collapse did not mark an ending, but a reckoning. Labor movements gained momentum, unions formed, and the language of rights replaced the language of servitude. The same hands that had scrubbed marble floors or forged steel rails now reached for something greater than wages. They reached for recognition. Strikes and protests filled the streets, not out of bitterness alone, but out of hope that the next generation would live a little freer. Through hardship, the ordinary citizen reclaimed agency, and in doing so, reshaped the nation's moral foundation. Those who had lived through both the height and fall of the Gilded Age carried scars that time could not easily erase. They had witnessed how quickly power can vanish, how fragile the idea of security truly is. Yet many refused to surrender to despair. The families who had lost their estates found meaning in the stories they told, preserving the memory of what once was, not to glorify it, but to understand it. Their descendants grew up surrounded not by luxury, but by lessons. That fortune is fleeting, that pride is dangerous, and that nothing, not even marble, can defy the passage of time. The landscape itself began to change. The once private lawns where only the wealthy could stroll became public grounds. The great avenues lined with palaces became neighborhoods of smaller homes, each with its own modest dream. What had once been a symbol of separation slowly became a canvas for unity. Cities learned to grow around the ghosts of their past, layering progress over ruin, resilience over loss. The gilded towers that once cast long shadows over the poor now stood as reminders, their remnants scattered among streets where life continued to pulse in simpler, more enduring rhythms. It was in the ordinary moments that the spirit of endurance revealed itself most clearly. The mother who worked 2 jobs to feed her children after her husband's factory closed, the veteran who returned from war and built a small business from nothing, the farmer who tilled land that had nearly been lost to debt. Their triumphs were quiet but profound. They proved that greatness need not be monumental to be meaningful. While the Gilded Age had celebrated the extraordinary few, the years that followed celebrated the collective strength of the many. Artists and writers turned their gaze toward this new reality. Gone were the romantic portraits of luxury. In their place came stories of struggle, perseverance, and truth. The American voice matured, finding beauty not in excess, but in honesty. Literature, painting, and song began to tell the story of those who had been invisible. The workers, the immigrants, the dreamers who built the bones of a nation. Out of loss emerged a new kind of art, one rooted in empathy rather than envy, in understanding rather than spectacle. The country that had once worshipped wealth began to value wisdom, and in that shift, it found renewal. The old estates that survived became museums, their gilded halls now open to all. Visitors walked through rooms once reserved for the powerful and felt not envy, but curiosity. They came to see how far the nation had come, how easily beauty can decay, and how deeply endurance can endure. The walls whispered stories not of grandeur, but of humility. Each cracked tile and faded painting spoke of impermanence, reminding those who passed through that history does not preserve splendor, it preserves lessons. In this transformation, America discovered a strange kind of grace. The ruins of its past became its teachers. The fall of the gilded palaces did not mark the death of the American dream, but its evolution, from a dream of possession to a dream of persistence, from conquest to creation. The strength that emerged was not loud or gilded. It was quiet, unadorned, and profoundly human. The people who had borne the burden of others' ambition now carried forward their own. They rebuilt not in marble but in meaning, not in gold but in grit. What survived the collapse of the Gilded Age was not its wealth but its wisdom, the understanding that no fortune can shield a person from change, that every era of splendor carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, and that when the towers fall, it is the ground, not the gold, that endures. The end of that age stripped away illusion and left behind the essence of what it means to begin again. To live not for grandeur but for grace, to build not for show but for survival, to find beauty not in permanence but in the will to keep going.